Welcome to Women and Witchcraft, the figure of the witch in history, literature, and pop culture, presented by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. This event is part of Dark Reflections, a scholarly series focusing on horror, folklore, death, and the macabre, featuring faculty and associate faculty from the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Megan Mell, Director of Alumni Experiences, and I will be your host for today's presentation and the entire Dark Reflections series. Thank you all for joining us this Halloween week as we get into the spooky spirit of the season. Throughout today's conversation, I encourage you to submit a question or reaction or comment for our presenter to address in the second half of the event. And to do this, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter in your question. This event is being recorded and will be shared out with all event participants and will also be available on the Women and Witchcraft event page. Today's presenter is Dr. Nicola Imbracsio. Dr. Imbracsio is Assistant Dean for Curriculum and Instruction in the College of Liberal Arts. She also teaches in the English department. She earned her PhD in English at the University of New Hampshire and her MFA in Applied Theater from Emerson College. She was founding member of Company One, working as a director, actor, producer, and puppeteer. Before coming to the University of Minnesota, Dr. Imbracsio was the director of the Center for Integrative Studies at Michigan State University and taught in the program, where she first developed the course in which today's presentation is based. So, why do witches continue to captivate our imagination? From ancient myths to modern pop culture, the witch has been feared and celebrated in countless ways. And today, Dr. Imbracsio will explore how the powerful figure of the witch has evolved through history, literature, and film. Dr. Imbracsio, thank you so much for joining us, and I invite you to begin today's presentation.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here. We're talking about one of my favorite topics and during my favorite season for one of my favorite classes. So I'm grateful that you're here, and I'm going to share my screen a bit so you can see some images as I'm talking. But first and foremost, I want you to think and then add in the chat what you think of when you hear the word witch. What images do you think of? What personalities that you think of? And just put that in the chat while I start to share my screen. So go ahead and put that in the chat because I'd love to see what you get. All right. Thanks for putting things in the chat. I'm seeing Salem, Massachusetts. I'm saying women in total control of herself. Macbeth, of course. An all-knowing teacher like myself, right? A mystic. This is what I'm looking for. Broomsticks, pointed hat, potions, a wise woman or a crone, wise woman, powerful hat, spells, books, independence. These are all fantastic. Wiccan. I like stop. Thank you, someone, for saying scary or negative. We often have really negative associations. Black capes, cats, cauldrons. Yes, the Wicked Witch from the Wizard of Oz for sure. Keep them coming. I'm going to get started as you keep on sharing those. Because what we have to recognize is often when we think about witch, what we're thinking about are these images that are kind of cultivated by pop culture. Like witches are often female. They're often figured or imagined as menacing. No one put green skin in there, but a lot of folks think of green skin largely from The Wizard of Oz. They're often old or crones or hags. They wear pointy hats, of course. They tend to wear all black clothing. And they have these objects with them, whether it be a broom, a cauldron, a cat, or they're familiar. But really, what is a witch? And perhaps the witch comes from something far older than all those modern cultural associations, but we'll dig into those too. Perhaps the witch is more of a legacy or a mythology originating in ancient Greece and Rome with figures such as Circe or Medea or Hecate. Or perhaps they come from another time, the Middle East, with legends like Lilith and Astarte and the Witch of Endor from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Perhaps the witch is a cross-dressed French revolutionary who hears the voices of angels and demons and is called a saint by some and burned as a witch and a heretic. Perhaps the witch is the product of years of witch hunts in Europe and America, woven into the literature of Shakespeare and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Arthur Miller. Perhaps for you, witch comes from a figure cultivated by Hollywood with green skin, flying monkeys, we didn't include those, and insatiable tastes. Perhaps, in fact, she's an artist, dressed in black, leather, or lace, singing about her power as a woman. Perhaps she's the bruja at the Botanica, a female figure, the Catrina from Dias los Muertos. Perhaps she is celebrations that combine Catholic tradition and ancient indigenous beliefs. Or perhaps she is Marie Laveau, voodoo queen of 19th century New Orleans. Perhaps she has more political manifestations now, as young women regularly who achieve greatness in politics, sports, or society and demand that their voices are listened to are often labeled as witch. Perhaps it's not a she, perhaps it's a he, or someone who rejects gender binaries altogether. So while we may not have a specific and precise cultural definition of witch, nearly every culture and language has a name and a word for this figure and her power. And that's because women and witches have always existed. And even though today, and in my class, I talk largely about the European and Northern American history of witchcraft, it's practiced all over the world in all cultures by all genders. And yet, often when we talk about witches, we're talking about women. And the vast majority of people who are persecuted in the name of witchcraft, both historically and even today in some countries and cultures, have been female. So let's go to the definition of witch, which I'm just pulling something here from Merriam-Webster. And it's one that is credited with usually malignant supernatural powers, especially a woman practicing usually black witchcraft, often with the aid of a devil or familiar. I want to focus here with the especially a woman. Even the dictionary kind of recognizes that there's a kind of a gendered association with this. But Ronald Hutton, who's a historian of folklore, states that there are actually four common definitions of witch: someone who uses magic for malevolent means, any person who uses magic at all, whether good or bad or mutual, a follower of nature based paganism, and finally, a figure of transgressive female power. Malcolm Gaskill, who is a historian of the supernatural and the occult, says witches resist simplification and are as diverse and as complicated as the context to which they belong: economy, politics, religion, family, community, and mentality. In other words, they're really kind of hard to figure out and nail down. But I'd like to point out that I'm not sure about the dictionary, but I can say about Hutton and Gaskill, these are definitions that are written by men and by two men who don't necessarily identify as witches. So I'd like to turn to the actual folks who do identify as witches and do identify as female. Because although people of all generations have been considered witches, the word is usually associated with women. And the course that I teach looks at the links between these concepts of witch, femininity, and power, which I want to point out also includes trans women and anyone on the feminine spectrum. And when we do that, it allows us to examine the transgressive power of this witch as an archetype and the persecution of women who have faced as a result of this perceived connection. So, oh, I'm missing something, but we'll start with Brie Luna. So Brie Luna, who's the founder and operator of Hood Witch, which is an Instagram account and a website and a media, I would say, empire, says offer that the witch, her definition of the witch is the power to boldly and unapologetically embrace nature, heal yourself, heal your community, to respect the seen and the unseen realms. It means the freedom to be your most authentic self, to embrace all aspects of whomever that may be, and fiercely. It's a lot different than those dictionary definitions. One of the OG of Salem, Massachusetts, the official witch of Salem, Laurie Cabot, says the witch personifies a woman's ability to intuit, create, enchant, protect, initiate, teach, and heal. Margaret Adler, author and witch, says that the witch is the woman who lives outside of society and outside of society's definition of women. And one of my favorites, Pam Grossman, who is an author and a podcaster and an artist, says the witch is the shadow cast by every woman you've ever known. So, with all of these definitions, we see that more than anything else, the witch is a shadowy symbol of feminine power and a force for subverting the status quo. She's a vessel that contains our own conflicting feelings about feminine power and our fear for it, our desire for it, and our hope that it can and will grow stronger despite the flames that are often thrown at it. I love Pam Grossman, who says that show me your witches and I'll show you your feelings about women. And that's largely a big part of what this course explores. I like to explore the archetype that the witch reveals more about the society and culture in which they're situated in than about actual witches or witchcraft in general. Whether they're depicted as villainous or virtuous, she's always a figure of freedom, both its loss and its gain. And I'd like to say that she often is the only, I would say she is the only female archetype who is an independent operator. Which is sorry, is an independent operator because women are often defined in terms of what their relationship is to others, specifically who they are or are not sleeping with, whether they're considered virgins, whores, daughters, mothers, wives. So, or the kind of care that she's giving or is given to her, some sort of debt she may have to eventually pay to someone else. But the witch owes nothing. And that's what makes her dangerous, and I would also argue somewhat divine. Witches have power on their own terms. They have agency, they create, they manifest, they praise, they commune with the spiritual realm. They metamorphose, they make things happen. They are change agents whose primary goal is to transform the world from what it is into what they want it to be. And that's why, like lots of other controversial identity words, being called a witch and calling yourself a witch are two very different things. The first case is an act of degradation, an attack against a perceived threat, where the second one is more of a reclamation. You see lots of women today calling themselves witches out of autonomy and pride. The witch is, for me, in many ways, the ultimate feminist icon because she is a fully rounded symbol of female oppression and liberation. And that's what my class largely looks like, the links between, as I said, witches, femininity, and power, and womanhood. And that includes trans women and anyone on the feminine spectrum. And the persecution that these people face and continue to face throughout time and history as they are associated with witchcraft. So my course offers an exploration of this archetype, and I'm going to give you a little bit of taste of this today. I'm going to walk you through some of the major touch points of the course. So when we start the course, we really kind of start in antiquity, specifically with the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And one of my first favorite witches, the first witch, often called Lilith. Now, the story of Lilith comes out of Jewish folklore. Scholars debate whether such a figure, in terms of mythology, actually existed in the minds and the myths of the Jewish people. Perhaps she might have been confused with the goddess Ishtar, who's on the right here. And even the relief that you see on the left, known as the Burney relief, has been questioned. Is it really Lilith? Is it a Lilith? So there's lots of swirling unknowns around this character. But the story of her does exist. And the story is this: as she is Adam's first wife, the woman that Adam is with before Eve, that God creates out of dust, as opposed to Adam's rib, which is where Eve it comes from. So they're created from the same material and therefore equal. She refuses to be subservient to Adam, and she flees the Garden of Eden after her husband demands that she lie beneath him during sex. But to double down, as she's running out of Eden, she does something even worse than refuse the missionary position. She speaks God's true, ineffable name into the air. And she does it full well knowing that she's going to be banished from Eden forever. She chooses exile over submission. Now, Lilith's nature as a witch, the first witch, as people call her, lives in these two revolutionary acts. She threatens the newly established order of patriarchal control, and she uses her voice to speak the true name of God, aka a spell. She knows the true name of the life force and uses it. And that is, in essence, witchcraft and the role of the witch to speak truth to power. After this story, Lilith pretty much disappears, except to be revised in romantic art and poetry. And there, she's often associated with Lucifer. In fact, is often thought to be the consort of Lucifer. When Lucifer has his fall from heaven, he takes up with Lilith. Now, this you might see this if you're a fan of shows like Lucifer on Netflix, which is a super fun show, or if you have watched the reboot of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. There is definitely a relationship between Lucifer and Lilith there. And I just find it really crazy that Lilith goes from this powerful, independent, autonomous woman who's yelling on her way out of Eden to essentially seeking her own liberation from male control, to essentially becoming the willing consort of Lucifer. And we see this shift happening all the time in many other witches in antiquity. Those figures like Circe, like Medea, the witch of Endor in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, these formidable women who are mysterious powers to heal and destroy, and who are often sought out for such powers. They're respected, and sometimes they're even feared. But that autonomy is eventually destroyed and diminished as time goes on. In fact, those figures are eventually used, often in the stories of literature and told by men, that these women represent the absolute worst of females in feminine power. They're sexually driven, they're evil, they're manipulative, they're going to eat your babies. And therefore, they cannot conceive of a reality where women operate independently and have their own power independently. So eventually they have to situate her in an unholy union with Lucifer. And here's an old woodcut of witches hanging out with devils and demons, because that's where they're actually getting their power from male demons and devils. But now, if you're anything like me and you heard the name Lilith and you're from the 90s, you might have immediately thought of the Lilith Fair, because Lilith eventually becomes reclaimed in the 90s, actually starting in the 60s. But like I said, if you're from my generation, in the 90s, in terms of being a symbol of real female independence. The Lilith Fair, if you're not aware, was a huge concert in the 90s going on for a couple of years, featuring all female bands originally and artists. And that's because of Lilith's story of her refusal to submit to a man, and a choice of hers to live on her own terms really echoed the experiences of so many female musicians trying to make a name for themselves in a male-dominated music industry. So we kind of start with this microcosm story of Lilith and how we see an evolution of this figure through time in my class. And then we do this sort of exercise several times and throughout touch points in history and literature. The next place we move on to is through historical witch hunts. And we spend a good time in, Europe, Northern Europe, and a good time in England as well. And it's here that students are introduced to one of the craziest texts in history, the Malleus Maleficarum, a copy of which exists in our own rare book collection, and I bring students to go see that, which is really fun. The Malleus Maleficarum, which stands or which means Hammer of the Witches, is actually one of the most dangerous books I think published. It was incredibly popular because of the new arrival of the printing press. So it was published, there was 14 editions by 1520, 16 by 1669. And it's incredibly popular and dangerous because it does lead to the death of so many people accused of witchcraft, both men and women, but a majority women. I think what's really interesting about this text is that it offers a very specific view of witchcraft, which we have kind of inherited today, and you see a lot in film and pop culture. It was also so popular during its time, and I would argue because it's a pretty salacious text, giving lots of examples of titillating devil sex. It's essentially the origin of the dark romance, perhaps. Um, but it was very, very, very popular because it was essentially a pious text with a lot of this like scandalous sexual acts happening in it. But what you learn from the Malleus Maleficorum are these pacts with the devil, like the idea that the witch has to have a pact with the devil. That comes from the Malleus Maleficorum. And again, from that idea that women can't possibly have this power on their own. It has to come through a male entity or a male consort. So the Malleus Maleficorum tells us that women must sign their name in a book or in a contract with the devil. Another part of witch behavior that the Malleus Maleficorum tells us about is the witches' Sabbath, the one night of the month where witches get together and they have this big feast, and their familiars and their demons are there, and they most likely drink the blood and ground bones of babies that they've kidnapped. So the witches' Sabbath is very important. During these feasts and Sabbaths, which is engage in the osculum infame, which is the kiss of shame. And that kiss of shame is where the witch has to kiss the ass of the devil. Again, it's a kind of supplication, and much like the witch's Sabbath, is almost a radical demonic reversal of the Catholic Mass, right? They are eating the blood and bones of kidnapped children instead of the exalted body of Christ. They are kissing the ass of the devil as opposed to kissing a figure of Christ. Of course, familiars. The Malleus Maleficorum tells us all about the familiars that witches employ to do their kind of evil works out in the world, or they get their information from the spirit realm. Rats, ducks, cats, bats, weasels, snails, frogs, all of these figures end up being the witch's familiar. It's also where we're introduced to the concept of aerial flight for witches. The idea that witches can fly through the air through potions, through the power the devil gives her, or through her brooms, right? Brooms figure very strongly in the Malleus Maleficorum. And in fact, in 1477, a French witch testifies at her accusation, most likely after being tortured, that after making a pact with the devil gave her an 18-inch stink and an ointment, and she puts the ointment on the stick in between her legs and utters the words, "Go," in the devil's name, and then flies through the air. Scholars have made long conjecture that the brooms, it's already part of their domestic life. They have brooms. Of course, women have brooms in their home if they're stuck in the domestic space. But also, there's definitely a phallic association with this in terms of women being in charge of their own sexual gratification. The Malleus Maleficorum, beyond telling us what witches' behavior was and what to look out for in your neighbors, also tell people how to identify them and prove that they're witches in various trials and courts and in town in your local village. And one of them is the devil's mark. This concept that the witch on her physical self, on her body and her skin, may have a devil's mark. It could be a birthmark. It could be a mole. It could be a beauty blemish. It could be a rash. It could be absolutely anything. But the concept is if you poke it with a needle, the needle will sink in and the witch will have no harm done to her. That's what makes her a witch. And there were, in fact, as in this image, specific needles to use to test for the devil's mark, many of which are in museums. And all of them have a retractable pointer. So it's essentially a parlor trick where it looks as though the needle is entering the flesh of the woman, but it's not. So a woman is being said that she has a birthmark or a mole and is tested with this device, which eventually is going to absolutely lead to evidence that she's a witch because the needle doesn't enter her skin. It's a retractable needle. There's also the swimming test. If you're a fan of Monty Python, you may have seen this in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a skit I do show to my students, where the idea that if a witch is put into water, weighted down, if she drowns, she's a woman and dead. And if she lives and floats, she's a witch and will be burnt to death. So in either case, she ends up drowning and dying. And then, of course, torture. Many women were tortured for their testimony of being a witch or also calling out other witches. This image here is the strappado, which comes from Italian torture techniques, in which an individual is hung by their arms from a pulley and a rope for a number of hours. And then sometimes over time, weights are put on their feet. So their arms dislocate from their shoulders. And torture, very common. And of course, after such torturous events, women tend to testify to being witches. In fact, between the 14th and 18th century, Germany, France, Scotland, the Netherlands, and England, approximately 45 to 60,000 people were accused, and 80% of those were women. Not just accused, but also convicted and killed for witchcraft. I always think it's important to point out that the 14th and 18th centuries is also the rise of humanism and the Renaissance. So at the same time that we're having this robust conversation of going back to older texts and understanding the human condition and the development of the beginning of the scientific thinking, we also have this really kind of inhumane experience visited upon women. Now, students don't know a lot about those European witch trials, but they do tend to know a lot about the American witch trials, those taking place in Salem, Massachusetts. Although honestly, Salem is not the only place. In fact, many counties around Salem engaged in witchcraft and witchcraft hunting and witchcraft trials. Students have heard of these, and we only saw 20 deaths in Salem. 15 women, 5 men, 19 were hung, 1 tortured to death. There was also 2 dogs, that should be noted, that were killed for being witches' familiars. But over 200 people were accused. And we might ask ourselves, why do we know about Salem, but not a lot of people know about the European witch trials? Part of that has to do with, I think, that it happened in America. We have an American myopia in terms of history. However, I think it also has something to do with these happened so late in history. By this point, the witch craze in Europe was over, and it was just almost resurfaced here in America. And then it resurfaced with these Puritan folks, which were supposed to be kind of stoic and kind of reasonable and relatively rational. But no, I mean, there's a huge witch craze. And despite the fact that these continue to share. And I also think Arthur Miller has something to do with this, and my students do read The Crucible by Arthur Miller. And of course, Hocus Pocus has something to do with this, takes place in Salem. But I think what's interesting about Salem is, though it has so much fascination, so much research, people are talking about it and have been for years. No one still knows why it occurred. It could be a number of reasons, including food poisoning or the religious climate or economics, class tensions, Indian attacks, witchcraft itself. Whichever of these we believe, though, the Salem trials look very similar to the European trials in that living conditions were pretty horrible. I'll go back to this. Living conditions were pretty horrible in America at that time. Brutal winters, invasion by local tribes, inter-community conflicts, and then, of course, the Puritan doctrine that really kind of had people living in fear of the idea that fear and the devil lurked around every corner. But the thing that's really interesting about the Salem trials, that's different than European trials, is the cadre of young women that sit at the center of this turmoil. Unlike the European trials, the women of Salem turned upon each other. And in so doing, they became so incredibly powerful and feared in their community. And this is kind of how it goes down. Sometime in 1691, 1692, 2 women in Reverend Samuel Parris's household start acting strangely. They have fits, they speak strangely, they act like they're being kicked and pinched, and they're being tormented by an unseen evil. They're diagnosed eventually as this being a psychic attack, not a medical one. And after they're diagnosed, it starts to spread to other girls in Salem. These young women begin accusing other women in Salem as witches, the witches who are, in fact, tormenting them. Again, this is at a time when acceptable Puritan girl behavior is speaking very infrequently, only when spoken to, and deference to male relatives. This behavior by these women caused such a stir, and it becomes a phenomenon for the region. Again, I go back to the difference here is that these women are wielding the power in their community. And here it's by calling other people witches. And in so doing, these women are actually able to be liberated like witches. They are the ones that are accusing others and we have the power of their community. And they wield an immense power, not just over who they're accusing, but also over the men in their community too, the reverend, the judges, the lawyers, everybody. So they accused three women, Elizabeth Parris, Abigail Adam. Oh, so three women. Sorry, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. What's really interesting about these three women is that they are outsiders themselves. Um, uh, the Sarah Good is a surly beggar woman her trials are hilarious. Osborne is a widow, so without a male consort, who's incredibly wealthy and is embroiled in local disputes over land. And then Tituba is an enslaved woman from Barbados who was enslaved by Reverend Parris himself. And I want to focus on Tituba because I feel that she is the most fascinating figure in all of this. Because while the other two women went to trial and denied the accusations that they were witch, Tituba did not. She gets on the stand and immediately confesses to everything. She says that she signed the devil's pact. She says she's rode through the night with him, that she has a familiar. She also spots signatures of others. She's seen the devil. Many scholars make the claim, and I think a viable one, that it's actually her enslaver, Reverend Parris, who most likely fed her a lot of this information, because how would Tituba necessarily know things that would come out of something like the Malleus Maleficorum? My favorite part of the trials, though, is when she's asked to describe what the devil looks like. And she says he is a tall man dressed in black with white hair, a description that I would say most aptly fits her enslaver, Samuel Parris. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that he could be confused for the Dark Lord. So I'm going to skip Giles Corey for now. By 1693, 200 people are accused of witchcraft. More than 550 confess, 19 are executed, and a few die in jail. Years later, in 1706, there's a public statement of apology issued to those who were murdered, killed, or whose lives were destroyed. Because even if you weren't accused, your lands got removed from you, your money and your inheritance were gone. It's after this work that we see some of the most popular cultural depictions of witches. Movies like The Craft, The Witch, Hocus Pocus that I show in my class, to discover these reverberations and how they keep on coming back about their historical moment, but often about our own. And finally, at the end of class, students read Naomi Alderman's novel, The Power, a fictional tale of women coming into their own power and changing the world. It's a wonderful, immersive, fantastic read. I highly recommend. They also meet and interview several women who identify as witches, a Buddhist herbalist in New Hampshire, a Catholic practitioner of Santeria in Puerto Rico, a trans folk witch in Ohio, and Jex Blackmore, a celebrated and at times reviled satanic witch and performance artist from Detroit. And so through all of this, students really end the class having a very complicated understanding of what the archetype of the witch is. And so I'm going to end that there with, I think I went a little bit over my time, so I can start doing some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imbracsio, it was a fascinating talk, and we covered a lot of history in a short amount of time. So thank you for that. We do have a lot of questions coming in, and we've had a couple. So I'm just about one specific question around, are you teaching the full course at the University of Minnesota? And if you're not a current student, can you audit your course?
Yes, I am teaching the full course at the University of Minnesota. I will say that I have long had ideas of doing a podcast based on this course, and now I feel like it's probably a good time. I should probably go ahead and do that. We're pretty much each week or each episode would be like like one on Lilith, one on the witch event, like moving through in that way. So stay tuned. Maybe there'll be a podcast. As for auditing, I'm not sure how that works.
All right, excellent. We'll find out some more information about that. A couple questions kind of going back in history. One person asked if you came across the story of the Pungo Witch or the Witch of Pungo in Virginia Beach area circa
No.
1700.
No, I have not heard of the Pungo Witch in Virginia Beach, but I'm going to be writing that down as something to investigate.
Wonderful. Looks like
Yeah,
there's a statue in the Virginia Beach Municipal Center of that particular
interesting.
person.
All
So,
right. I do have to say, what's interesting, if you go to Salem, Massachusetts, which is Witch City, USA, you will find a statue of Samantha the witch from Bewitched, which I think is also really fascinating.
a classic witch.
Yeah, of course, right?
We do have another question. Someone was interested about the origins of the engraving on the slide that you showed titled Nature of the Witch. They thought it
Okay.
was similar to some engravings on their copy of Dante's Divine Comedy.
Oh yes, this is actually so all most of the images I use in all my class and in this webinar actually come from woodcuts of special collection items that we may have here in our library or you can access free online. And so this is a conjuring. This is not from Dante's. This is considered a conjuring of a witch of various spirits. I can try to, if you get my email, you can send it to me and I'll give you the actual citation.
A historical question. Were the numbers for deaths in the 14th and to 18th century so much higher in Germany because they have a bigger population than other countries, or was there something about German culture?
Ah, I wouldn't say it's anything about German culture. I'd say it's where the Malleus Maleficorum comes from. So it's also the seat of really, really, really strong um it starts there and it's published there with because of the Gutenberg's printing press, it's able to kind of proliferate. So I think part of its population, but also part of it is that's kind of where that text is published and disseminated from. So there's more happening in Germany and then eventually France and in England as well. You don't see as many witch trials and accusations in countries like Italy, Portugal, Spain, as much as you do in the north, just because I think it takes longer eventually for it to get there. And then so when it does get there, the craze is largely over at that point.
And can you remind us when that book was published and how long was it in use, or when did it fall out of
Oh,
popularity?
so I mean, I, I would like to say, I don't think anyone's referencing it now, but it's published in 1486 in Germany, and it's published in Latin, but it's a German origin, and so it's published in 1486, and then it has additional editions in 1520, 1669, and just to give you a sense, printing a text in that time period is laborious and time consuming. And it's very expensive because paper and vellum is expensive. So just the fact that, there's something like, 30 editions over the course of 100 years is pretty phenomenal for a text like that, which is very precise. Again, it's about, you have to be kind of interested in the topic.
Absolutely. One of our audience members is asking, they're interested, you pointed out the shared time period of the witch trials and the Renaissance period. What
Mm.
do you think is the relationship between these two events coinciding?
I think well, often students ask me why, like, why did this happen? Why does the witch hunt start in Europe? And yes, part of it, why is the Maleficorum even written? And the major thing that happens in European history that calls for that, we can talk about economics. Economics has a lot to do with it. We can talk about the rise of science in terms of the local healer, witch woman being displaced by the scientific doctor professional. That's probably it too. But I would say that one of the major things is the plague that happens in the 14th century, because while we have social structures and areas of and organizations and institutions of social trust, The plague undermines all of that. Mass hysteria, people dying, people questioning the existence of God, people questioning and asking, why is this happening to us? And most of the answers is, well, it's someone over there, right? It can't be us. So it's not me. It's got to be because often Jews, often witches, often immigrants, often, right? So just various, again, marginalized people get scapegoated for the Black Plague, witches being one of them, women being one of them. So all of those factors come together to kind of cause this witch craze hunt. But yet you're right, it's happening at the same time as the Renaissance is happening. I would like you, one could also make the argument, I think, that the Renaissance is happening in cities. Witch hunts are not necessarily happening in cities. Uh, I didn't talk about it here, but the course spends a good deal of time in England, which is my area of specialty. So we spend a lot of time on early modern witch crazes and witch hunts. King James, the successor of Elizabeth the First, is obsessed with witches. In fact, he writes his own book, um, kind of a companion piece, a Protestant companion piece to the Maleficorum, in which he details the existence of witches and what to do with them. This is why Shakespeare writes Macbeth, to kind of appease his benefactor, right? Because he knows James is so into witches. But there's also a whole bunch of other plays that happen at that same time in the 17th century, written by Shakespeare's contemporaries, which are far more comedic than Shakespeare's, because a lot of people living in the cities are like, this witch thing is just crazy. Because, we're moving on with the Renaissance and being humanists, but we got a king and a lot of other people who think this stuff is real and trying to balance that power dynamic, right? So a lot of other witch plays are more comedies and parodies of this phenomenon. But I will say this: 7 women from Lancashire were put into a London jail accused of witchcraft, and 3 of them didn't make it out alive because they die while incarcerated. And there's a play that's later written about them called The Late Lancashire Witches, which is about the occurrences in Lancashire while these women are being accused. And while the play is being performed, these women are sitting in a jail in London, eventually some of them dying. So it can be fun and it can be comedic, but there are some really real traumatic and horrible things that end up happening to these people who are accused of witchcraft. I kind of hope I answered that question.
I think so. So we're
Great.
going to stick with literature and go a little further back. One of our guests has a question. They're curious if you've used this lens on much medieval literature, particularly in the Arthurian tradition. So there's a lot of female practitioners of magic, and they want to know just if you've used
Yeah.
this lens before.
Yes. So I'm a big fan. My time period of specialty is more late medieval to in early modern, right? But I don't, in this class, I don't go back before the European witch. I mean, I start with antiquity, but I don't spend a lot of time with medieval witches, especially since those women are very interesting, though. If we think of Morgana, Morgan Le Fay, they are engaged in a kind of magic. That is, again, a blend of pagan Celtic tradition and this new Catholic tradition. I don't do that in my class, but maybe it's something to consider for my podcast.
Yes, I fully support this podcast idea, as do people in the Q&A as well,
Thank you.
also in support of it. One person had a question: why are there less references to witches in Nordic folklore
Mm.
than in other areas of the world?
I guess that's not my area of specialty. Although I am fascinated with like Icelandic sagas. That's just something I like in my spare time. Um, I did a class in Iceland in which I taught about Icelandic sagas, and I think again, that's Icelandic is different than Nordic, but it's familiar. It's in the same family. There's a real fascination with the supernatural, specifically in the natural world, and like monsters and supernatural figures. The witch character of those, and there's a lot of witchcraft happening in Iceland, but in those societies, they tend to be more male than female. So if you go to a place like the Witchcraft Museum, I've been, it's amazing, in Iceland, many of the practitioners of witchcraft are male. I just like in this particular class, because of various other theoretical apparatus I use, it's definitely focusing on kind of a feminist theory and a feminist criticism of the witch. So we don't spend a lot of time, at least in the course content, talking about male witches. However, sometimes students end up doing projects on that kind of thing. So a lot of students end up really love the idea of Giles Corey, who's a male witch accused in Salem, or they think, or they find in pop culture, how are male witches? There's a lot of new like anime and illustrated texts about male witches, trans witches, gay witches. It's amazing stuff. But I don't do a lot of Nordic stuff. I only have so much time. Again, maybe it's for the podcast.
Fair enough. In your presentation, you mentioned there was a public apology in 1706, I
Yeah.
believe.
Mhm.
And one of our guests is asking, of the European and American regions that had witch hunts, how many have publicly apologized for them?
Oh, as far as I mean, I think Lancashire also has one in England. I think you can, when you go there, there's a plaque kind of acknowledging that this was horrible. The Salem, if anyone has had the opportunity to go to Salem, Massachusetts, if you're native of New England, you avoid that city in the month of October because it's a little insane. But there is, in fact, a lovely memorial, a very somber memorial to these people who were accused and murdered, killed for being witches. And that is all, there's also a plaque there issuing that public apology, but it's actually a beautiful memorial in a tree grove. I think we have to remember when we think about the Salem witch trials and even the European witch trials, the concept that any of these women identified as witches is far outside the realm of the possible. These are people who were really steeped in their own Judeo-Christian religions and traditions. And the idea of being accused as a witch would be almost as horrifying as being one. So the fact that these women were eventually killed for something that they did not do, and that they also would have been horrified to think that they had, is real. And the memorial really does kind of carry that kind of somber um, vibe, lack of a better word.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
And I know that we talk a lot about the Salem witch trials. Why, one of our audience members is asking, why are the Connecticut witch trials so under discussed?
I don't know, maybe because it's Connecticut. Sorry if you're from Connecticut. I'm from Massachusetts. Um, but no, but I would say there's witch trials that happen. There are very few states in New England that didn't have witch trials. New Hampshire is one of them. They didn't have any witch accusations in New Hampshire, but there were in Connecticut and Maine, Rhode Island, which was part of Massachusetts at the time, absolutely happening all over. And I don't know why Connecticut isn't as, I think maybe it just wasn't as sensational as Salem, and you don't have a Hocus Pocus movie. That's probably another reason. But I do think what's really interesting, in fact, the first person accused and killed for witchcraft in the Commonwealth and New England is actually a woman in Boston who was accused of being a witch, and she was Catholic. So she was hired and employed by Protestants to be a domestic help. And she was Catholic and she could not say the Lord's Prayer. And she said it in Irish Gaelic. So here we have an instance of a person who's actually very, again, like they are not a witch, they are steeped in their own religious tradition. And it's just a case of that religious tradition not really being recognized or understood by the folks who are in power. But yeah, I don't know why Connecticut isn't elevated. I also want to say that this whole presentation is largely talking about like historical, sensational people who aren't really witches and things happening in the past. I just want to make sure that I don't leave this presentation, or you don't leave this presentation thinking this is something that just happens in the past. Women are accused of witches as witches today in India and nations in Africa, and they're stoned, they're killed. And it's largely because, again, they're just speaking some kind of truth to power. They're not conforming to the status quo. Perhaps they're engaging in their own medical care. And I would say even today, even in our own political discourse, we often say it's a witch hunt, or she's a witch, or they're a witch. So this whole concept of the witch is still a really dangerous, identifier that some women in other cultures and countries are still being persecuted for, again, whether they are or not identifying as witches themselves.
That's an important point to make. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Um, Moving into kind of more current or modern day, we have a question from an audience member, which it's very detailed and I'm going to try to summarize it a little bit. They appreciated historical trajectory all the way through Lilith, bringing us to the 90s and Lilith Fair. But they're wondering if you fast forward to more recent representations in films like Season of the Witch from
Oh, yeah.
2011, The Witch
Yep.
2015, where the Christian devil is real, the witches are demons with actual diabolical powers, and any implicit gender and power critique aligned with unthinkable evils. So are we moving backward in our representation or thinking about witches?
I think it depends on how you read some of those. Like I find The Witch, the film, the Eggers film, I show it in my class to be to be a really complicated and slightly ambiguous ending there. And that's what my students and I spend a lot of time unpacking. Like what is actually happening in this film? Is there witches really existing? Is it a doubling? Is it a fantasy? Is it a fever dream? Did they have some bad corn? You know, there's all these potential things going on in that film. And I'm a big fan of that film. I think there's something where is a bit of a devolution in terms of that the witch figure being seen still always in a kind of comparison to a Christian or Judeo-Christian reality, right? It's still the other, always the other. I really encourage people to also though think of some perhaps other cultural texts that my class looks at. I love the film The Love Witch, which is, I can't remember the year or the director, but again, highly recommend. It's a woman who is a witch and a serial killer. She punishes the men who break up with her. Now, this seems flippant and kind of problematic in itself, but the film actually does a lot of cinematic exploration of the female gaze versus the male gaze versus society. And there's so many great scenes to explore there that I feel like really explode a lot of this. I also highly recommend The Thrilling Adventures of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the Netflix special, because while that whole series starts out with that dynamic of the pact and the Lucifer, and by the end of that show, the witches of that coven in that society are now invoking Hecate as a female goddess as opposed to being beholden to Lucifer as a male god. So I think there are these moments within these cultural texts that do offer us a bit more of transgressiveness again. But I will just want to say, with the few minutes I have left, that the reason I invented this class in the first place is not only do I just think it's super fun, but I spend October pretty much the entire month of October watching spooky movies. And those spooky movies are like old ones, B horror films, Hammer horror, like the old schlocky stuff. Like if it's got Christopher Lee in it, I'm watching it. But there was one season where I just happened to watch a whole bunch of witch movies, things like Horror Hotel, The Craft, huge fan, The Craft, another one called The Woods, in which all these stories depicted these young female characters at the brink of their teenage lives, going in, and they're in school, they're in college or high school, and something happens and they end up being a witch. So, but what that something ends up happening is that the women in those scenarios often go to school thinking it's going to be the ultimate leveler and the equalizer. It's going to be a meritocracy. It doesn't matter if I'm male or female because these films are taking place in the 60s, 90s. All that matters is that I do my best. And then they get there and they realize there is a system, and that system is still run by men, and meritocracy doesn't exist. The only power that I can truly access is my own power, an older power. And so we have all these films that involve young women, usually in educational institutions and settings, realizing that the systems and powers that run their world are ones that they can't have access to. So they're going to have to get together with their besties and make a change. And I find that that ends up being a really rife narrative for the students in my class, no matter how they identify as women or men, is understanding that there are some really other inherent structures that we engage in as a society that tend to write us for who we are. And the more that we can be liberated and autonomous and kind of look at those structures for what they are, is the more power we can have in our own personal lives.
Well, that is a perfect note to end things on. Thank you so much to our presenter, Dr. Nicola Imbracsio, for walking us through the complex nature of the witch and how it continues to inspire us today. Our next event in the Dark Reflections series will be Scandinavian Gothic, a century of Nordic horror cinema, on Thursday, October 30th at 12 o'clock p.m. Central Time. You can find more information about this and other presentations by visiting our website at z.umn.edu/darkreflections. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and I'm wishing you a thrilling Halloween.